I knew my wife had misunderstood the room when she smiled at the lawyer before she smiled at me. That was the first thing I noticed on Christmas night. Not the snow tapping against the tall windows, not the brass candles burning down the center of the table, not the $80 million trust agreement resting beside her dinner plate, like an expensive place card. It was Claire's smile, bright, polished, and certain, the kind of smile people wear when they believe the hard part is already over. She held the pen between two fingers, her wedding ring catching the gold light from the chandelier, while our son slept in a white bassinet near the fireplace, wrapped in a green blanket my mother had knitted before she passed. The house smelled like roasted turkey, cinnamon, pine needles, and the kind of expensive red wine Claire only opened when she wanted people to believe we were happier than we were. Around us, the Whitaker dining room looked like a painting from a Christmas card: silver chargers, crystal glasses, fresh garland across the mantel, a 12-foot tree glowing in the corner. Every ornament reflected a softer version of the truth. Claire looked across the table at me and said, "Ethan, this is for Noah's future." Her voice was sweet enough to frost glass. I nodded once, because that was all I trusted myself to do. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ruin dinner. I didn't tell her that my father's trust had teeth, or that the woman sitting beside the cranberry sauce, Margaret Hale, had spent 37 years writing contracts that could survive greed, grief, divorce, and every pretty lie people tell when money enters the room. Claire thought the baby was the key to my family's $80 million trust. She thought giving me a son meant the vault would finally open and pour the Whitaker name into her hands. What she didn't understand was that keys can turn both ways. Sometimes they open a door. Sometimes they lock it forever. Margaret slid the document forward with calm, careful hands. "This is the spousal acknowledgement," she said, her voice steady, almost kind. "Standard procedure before any beneficiary transition." Claire barely listened. Her eyes were on the signature line. She had been waiting for that line for months, maybe longer. I watched the pen touch the paper. The scratch of ink sounded louder than the Christmas music drifting from the living room speakers, louder than the fire popping in the hearth, louder than my own heartbeat. Her name curved across the page in smooth blue strokes: Claire Elizabeth Whitaker. When she finished, she lifted her chin like a woman stepping into the life she believed she deserved. For 1 second, she looked beautiful. Not loving, not sorry. Beautiful in the cold way ice looks beautiful before it cracks under your feet. She set the pen down and reached for her wine, but her hand trembled just enough for me to see it. Maybe some part of her knew. Maybe the body understands danger before pride does. Margaret placed her palm on the document and waited for the ink to dry. Noah shifted in his bassinet, making a small sound that tightened something deep in my chest. I looked at him, then back at Claire, and the room that had felt warm a minute earlier suddenly felt as cold as the December glass behind me. My father used to say money does not change people. It only gives their real character better lighting. That night, under every Christmas bulb and candle flame in that room, Claire finally stepped into the light. And the moment her signature dried, she lost everything she came there to take. I was not raised like people expect an heir to be raised. There were no marble staircases in my childhood, no private chef sliding breakfast in front of me, no father handing me car keys at 16 like money was a weather condition that always stayed sunny. William Whitaker made sure of that. He had money, real money, the kind that could change the temperature in a room before anyone said a word, but he never let it sit on my shoulders like a crown. He raised me in a brick house outside Richmond, Virginia, on 12 quiet acres where the grass needed mowing, the gutters needed cleaning, and every boy with the Whitaker name learned how to hold a rake before he learned how to hold a bank card. My father built his life the slow way. Warehouses first, then freight routes, then commercial, land, then a logistics company that moved everything from hospital equipment to farm machinery across half the country. By the time I was old enough to understand balance sheets, he had already turned old loading docks and stubborn patience into a family fortune most people only read about in business magazines at airports. But at home, he was still the man who patched fence posts in a flannel shirt and made me sweep the garage twice if I left dust in the corners. He believed comfort could rot a person if it came too early. He believed money without discipline was just gasoline poured on weakness. And he believed love should never be confused with access. That was why the Whitaker Legacy Trust existed. He created it after my mother got sick, when the house went quiet and every hallway seemed to echo with things none of us were brave enough to say. I was 29 then, old enough to know grief had paperwork, but young enough to believe families did not need protection from the people they welcomed in. My father knew better. He sat me down in his study one rainy November afternoon, 2 years before he died, and showed me the first binder. It was dark green leather, plain, heavy, and colder than it looked. $80 million in assets, land, accounts, company shares, insurance structures, and legal protections folded into something that did not feel like wealth as much as it felt like a locked gate. I remember laughing a little because I thought he was being dramatic. He did not laugh back. He tapped the binder once with 2 fingers and said, "Ethan, a family legacy is not tested when everyone is honest. It is tested when someone walks in smiling." I hated that sentence then. It sounded bitter. It sounded lonely. It sounded like the kind of warning older men give when life has disappointed them too many times. I wanted to believe I would choose better, love better, build something cleaner than the marriages I had seen crack under money and pride. So I signed what he asked me to sign, listened to Margaret Hale explain beneficiary transitions, bloodline protections, spousal acknowledgments, independent verification, and all the other phrases that seemed too cold to belong anywhere near a family. Then I put the binder away and spent years pretending it was just one of my father's old fears sealed in legal language. When I met Claire, that was the version of myself I wanted to be. Not an heir, not a trust beneficiary, just Ethan Whitaker, a man who drove a 7-year-old Ford pickup, managed family properties, fixed his own porch steps, and knew exactly how much a gallon of milk cost at Kroger. Claire saw me that way at first, or at least she let me believe she did. She liked my quietness. She said rich men bored her when they performed their money like a magic trick. She said my hands looked like they knew how to build things. I believed her because I needed to. Grief makes a man grateful for warmth, even when he should be checking where the heat is coming from. For a while, with Claire, life felt almost ordinary enough to trust. Sunday coffee, grocery lists, Christmas lights tangled in cardboard boxes. The kind of peace a man mistakes for proof. Looking back now, I understand my father was never trying to make me suspicious. He was trying to make sure that if I ever mistook hunger for love, the truth would still have a place to stand. Claire came into my life looking like the answer to a question I had been too proud to ask. She was not loud about beauty. She did not need to be. She had that clean Virginia polish, soft blonde hair always pinned just right, pale blue eyes that made people lower their voices without realizing it, and a smile that could make a room rearrange itself around her. I met her at a charity auction in Charlottesville, standing beside a table of silent bid sheets and pretending to care about antique silver. She was wearing a navy dress and holding a paper cup of coffee like she was the only honest person in a room full of rented tuxedos. When she asked me whether anyone actually needed a $2,000 duck decoy, I laughed harder than the joke deserved. That was how it started. Not with fireworks. With relief. Claire was smart, quick, and warm in public without seeming fake. She worked in event consulting then, planning fundraisers for museums, hospitals, and old families who liked their generosity photographed from the right angle. She understood manners the way musicians understand rhythm. She knew when to touch an elbow, when to tilt her head, when to remember a name she had only heard once. At first, I admired it. I thought it meant she cared about people. Later, I understood she cared about rooms, how they worked, who mattered in them, and how close she could stand to power without looking like she was reaching for it. In those early months, she made ordinary things feel chosen. We ate burgers at a roadside place outside Fredericksburg, and she said it was better than any country club dinner. We spent a Saturday fixing the back steps on my house, and she showed up in old jeans, laughing when paint got on her wrist. She told me she loved that I did not act rich. She said men with money usually talk like they were waiting for applause. I remember the way that sentence landed in me, warm and dangerous. A lonely man will mistake being understood for being safe. By the time I introduced her to Margaret Hale, Claire already knew enough to act unimpressed. Margaret watched her over the rim of a coffee mug in my father's old study, polite, but still. Claire smiled, asked good questions, and never once mentioned the trust. That impressed me more than it should have. Most people circled the Whitaker name eventually, testing it with little jokes, little assumptions, little fishing lines thrown into conversation. Claire did not. She let the silence do the work. We married 18 months later at a small Episcopal church with white roses on the pews and rain tapping against the stained glass. My father was already gone, but I carried his watch in my pocket. Claire cried when she said her vows. Real tears, or so I believed. At the reception, she held my face between her hands and told me she did not want a perfect life, just a real one. I built a home around that sentence. I gave her every benefit of every doubt. The first year was peaceful in the way new marriages can be when both people are still performing the best version of themselves. She made the house brighter. New curtains, fresh paint, dinner parties where the candles were never crooked, and the flowers always looked accidental in the expensive way. I liked watching her move through our life as if she belonged there. Maybe that was the problem. I wanted her to belong so badly that I ignored how quickly belonging turned into upgrading. The practical sedan she had driven for years suddenly felt embarrassing. The kitchen was functional, but not suitable for entertaining. My pickup was reliable, but apparently sent the wrong message when we pulled up to certain events. She never demanded at first. She suggested. She sighed. She compared. She would run her fingers over a magazine photo of a stone house in horse country and say, "Can you imagine hosting Christmas there?" Then she would smile at me like it was only a dream. But dreams become invoices when the wrong person is holding them. Little by little, the woman who once said she loved my quiet life began treating that life like a waiting room. I told myself ambition was not a sin. I told myself wanting beauty did not make her shallow. I told myself every marriage had seasons of adjustment. But there are moments you do not recognize until years later. One came at a donor dinner in Richmond, when a man I barely knew referred to me as one of the Whitaker heirs. Claire's hand tightened around my arm, not from discomfort, from interest. Her eyes did not turn to me. They turned to the room, measuring how many people had heard it. That was the first time I saw her look at my last name like it was not attached to a husband, but to a door. The first time Claire asked about the trust directly, she was standing at the kitchen island peeling the label off a bottle of sparkling water. It was a Tuesday evening in late March, the kind of night where rain hung over the windows but never quite fell. I had just come in from checking a rental property near Short Pump, my jacket damp at the shoulders, my boots leaving small dark marks on the mudroom tile. Claire had a legal pad open beside her phone, though she closed it the moment I walked in. That should have stayed with me. At the time, I only noticed the way she smiled too quickly. "I was thinking," she said, light and casual, "your father must have had a plan for when we start a family." I hung my keys on the hook by the pantry. He had plans for everything. She laughed, but it did not reach her eyes. "I mean financially. For children. For your bloodline." That word did not belong in her mouth. Bloodline. It sounded old, polished, and hungry. I reached for a glass and kept my voice even. "There are protections in place." Her fingers stopped on the bottle. Protections from what? I looked at her then, really looked. Her hair was perfect, her sweater soft cream, her wedding ring turned toward the light as if it had been positioned there. Nothing about her looked dangerous. That is the thing about warning signs in a marriage. They rarely arrive screaming. Most of them come dressed as normal conversation. I told her the truth, but not all of it. My father wanted the family assets handled carefully. That is all. Claire nodded slowly, filing the answer somewhere behind her eyes. After that, the questions came spaced far enough apart to pretend they were harmless. One Sunday over coffee, she asked whether a spouse could ever serve as trustee. In May, while we were driving past a gated community in Goochland County, she wondered aloud whether family property passed faster once children were involved. At a 4th of July cookout, after 2 glasses of white wine, she joked that rich families probably made everyone sign papers before cutting the cake. People laughed. I smiled. Margaret Hale, who happened to be standing by the lemonade pitcher, did not. She watched Claire the way my father used to watch storm clouds over the pasture. Quietly. Without panic. Without looking away. The shift in our house was not dramatic. It was colder than drama. Claire stopped asking about my day and started asking about valuations. She stopped saying, "our future," and started saying, "the structure." She asked how many warehouses were still under the Whitaker umbrella, whether the land near Norfolk had appreciated, how much income commercial leases produced in a slow year. She learned phrases I had never taught her. Beneficiary rights. Marital interest. Distribution trigger. I would hear them slip into conversation like keys testing. Locks. Each time, My stomach tightened a little more, and each time I explained it away because explanation is easier than suspicion when the person across from you wears your last name. Then came the password on her phone. Then the late lunches that became afternoon meetings. Then a new Pilates studio she suddenly loved across town, even though she had always hated driving more than 20 minutes for anything. I did not accuse her. Men like me are trained to fix hinges before we admit the frame is crooked. I changed the air filters, balanced accounts, booked dinners, brought home flowers she placed in vases without smelling. The house still looked beautiful. That made it worse. Every room had Claire's taste in it. Pale rugs, brass lamps, clean white walls, and underneath all that brightness, something unseen had begun to rot. One night in August, I found the legal pad she had closed months earlier. It was tucked under a stack of catalogs in the sitting room, not hidden well enough to be innocent, not hidden poorly enough to be an accident. I should have left it there. Instead, I opened it. The page was filled with neat blue handwriting. Not grocery lists, not party plans. Names, dates, asset categories, arrows, questions. At the top, circled twice, were 3 words: child unlocks trust. I stood there with the paper in my hands while the grandfather clock ticked in the hallway, steady and merciless. For a moment, I could not hear the rain outside or the hum of the refrigerator or Claire moving upstairs. All I heard was my father's voice from years ago, low and tired in that old study. A family legacy is tested when someone walks in smiling. I closed the pad, set it exactly where I found it, and walked to the window. My reflection looked calm. That almost scared me more than the note. Because deep down, something had stopped pleading for a reasonable explanation. Something had started counting moves. Ryan Keller did not enter our marriage like a villain. That would have been easier. Villains announce themselves. Ryan arrived as a name on a schedule, a familiar laugh in the background of a phone call, a man from Claire's old circle who had opened a private fitness studio near Carytown and somehow became necessary to her week. She mentioned him first in September while sorting through mail at the kitchen counter. Ryan says posture work could help my headaches, she said, as if I had asked. I looked up from a property tax bill. Ryan Keller, from college. I told you about him. She had not. Or maybe she had said his name once in passing, the way people drop pebbles on a path before they expect you to follow it. I nodded because the moment did not seem worth turning into a question. That is how distance grows in a house. Not through one big door closing, but through 100 small doors you convince yourself not to open. Ryan was 40, maybe a little younger, with silver starting at his temples in the controlled way men pay barbers to preserve. He had a downtown studio with black walls, polished concrete floors, and clients who paid more per month than some families paid on car notes. I saw him once by accident, standing beside Claire after a charity planning meeting outside the Jefferson Hotel. He was tall, tanned from winter vacations, wearing a quarter zip that looked simple until you noticed the cut. Claire laughed at something he said, her head tipping back, her hand touching his arm for half a second too long. It was not proof. That was the cruel part. It was only a picture your mind refuses to stop developing. When she saw me across the valet lane, her smile tightened before it brightened. Ryan turned and offered his hand. You must be Ethan, he said, like he had been looking forward to meeting a roomer. His grip was firm, his teeth perfect, his eyes doing fast math. I had met men like him before. Men who studied another man's watch, truck, shoes, wife, and posture before deciding how much respect to spend. Claire talks about you, he added. All good, I hope. Claire laughed first. Too quickly. I smiled because I had learned from my father that silence makes careless people uncomfortable. That depends on what she needs you to believe. The air shifted. Only an inch, but I felt it. Ryan's smile held. Claire's did not. On the drive home, she stared out the window, angry in that quiet way that asks you to apologize before any accusation has been made. You embarrassed me, she said near a stoplight on Broad Street. I kept both hands on the wheel. I shook his hand. You made it weird. I wanted to ask why weird felt so close to true, but I let the question sit behind my teeth. By October, Ryan was everywhere without ever being in the house. His name appeared in conversation like background music. Ryan recommended a nutritionist. Ryan knew a couple who bought in Keswick. Ryan said people with old family assets needed modern liquidity. That last one landed hard. I was reading in the den when Claire said it from the doorway, wrapped in a robe, her phone glowing in her hand. What does Ryan know about old family assets? I asked. She blinked once. It was just a conversation. About my family? About families like yours. There it was again. Yours, not ours. The word slid between us and lay there on the rug. After that, I noticed more because I finally allowed myself to. Her phone face down at dinner. Her perfume changed. She took calls in the laundry room, where the dryer could cover a low voice. She smiled at texts with a softness I had not seen aimed at me in months. None of it would hold up in court. All of it held up in my chest. One Friday afternoon, I stopped by her Pilates studio to surprise her with lunch from a place she liked on Grove Avenue. The woman at the front desk smiled and said Claire had canceled her membership 3 months earlier. I remember the paper bag warm in my hand, the smell of grilled chicken and rosemary rising through the handles, ordinary and useless. Outside, the November wind pushed dry leaves along the curb. I sat in my truck for a full minute without starting the engine. My face in the rearview mirror looked like a man waiting for bad news he had already received. That night, Claire came home at 6:30, kissed my cheek, and said class had been exhausting. I did not confront her. Not then. I asked if she wanted dinner, and she said she was not hungry. Upstairs, the shower ran for 20 minutes. Downstairs, I opened my father's old green binder for the first time in years. The pages smelled faintly of leather and dust, but the language inside was sharp as winter light. Independent verification, spousal acknowledgement, fraudulent inducement, beneficiary protection. I read until the words stopped looking cold and started looking merciful. Somewhere above me, Claire moved through the bedroom like nothing had changed. But something had. I was no longer trying to prove my wife was innocent. I was trying to make sure her lies did not get to write the ending. Claire told me she was pregnant on the first Sunday of December, while frost still clung to the fence posts and the whole house smelled like coffee, pine, and the cinnamon rolls she had suddenly decided to bake from scratch. I remember the scene too clearly, which is how I know my mind was already bracing for impact. She had decorated early that year, earlier than usual, wreaths on every window, white lights around the banister, silver ribbon threaded through the tree in perfect spirals. Everything looked warm enough to forgive. She came into the kitchen wearing one of my old Virginia sweatshirts, sleeves pulled over her hands, face soft in a way I had not seen in months. For one dangerous second, I let myself hope. She placed a small white box on the table between my coffee mug and the folded Sunday paper. No speech, no tears, just that box. I opened it and found a pair of tiny socks, pale blue, no bigger than my palm. The room went still around me. I had imagined that moment once, years earlier, before the trust questions, before Ryan Keller, before the legal pad and the lies stacked so neatly in the corners of our house. I had imagined pulling my wife into my arms, laughing into her hair, calling Margaret to say my father would have been proud. Instead, I sat there with those little socks in my hand and felt two truths collide so hard I could barely breathe. A child was coming, and I no longer knew what kind of story he was being born into. Claire watched my face like an investor watching a stock ticker. "Ethan," she whispered, "we are going to be parents." She said the right words. Her voice trembled in the right places. But her eyes were not on the socks. They were on me, searching for the door in my expression, the hinge, the lock, the moment the Whitaker fortune began to move. I stood and held her because there are habits deeper than suspicion. Her body relaxed against me, and for the first time in months, she let herself seem small. I wanted it to be real. God help me. I wanted it so badly that wanting became its own kind of pain. That week, Claire changed. Not back into the woman I married. Into someone sweeter, sharper, more careful. She made breakfast. She left little notes on my desk. She talked about nursery colors and private schools and whether children should grow up around horses. She started calling the baby our miracle whenever someone else could hear it. In private, the word changed. Future, security, legacy. She said them while folding baby blankets, while scrolling through real estate listings, while standing in the doorway of my study with her hand resting lightly over the place where our lives were supposed to be growing together. The first time she asked about a beneficiary transition after the pregnancy announcement, I was hanging garland over the fireplace. "We should probably speak with Margaret soon," she said, "before the baby comes." I kept wrapping green wire around the nail. "About what?" "Ethan, do not do that." Her tone was gentle, but the patience in it was thin. Your father built those protections for his descendants. If we are having his grandchild, there should be a plan. I looked down at her from the small ladder. The firelight touched her face and made her look almost innocent. Almost. There is a plan. She smiled. Then let us make sure everyone is honoring it. Everyone. Not us. Not you. Everyone. By mid-December, she had already decided Christmas dinner would be the perfect time. She wanted Margaret there, along with my Aunt Patricia, 2 cousins from Northern Virginia, and a few old family friends who still treated the Whitaker name like a church bell. Claire said it would be meaningful to make the announcement formal, to celebrate the baby as part of the family. She ordered place cards, hired a caterer from Richmond, and bought a white maternity dress she said was simple, though the receipt said otherwise. I let her plan it. I let her polish the trap until she could see her own reflection in it. But every night after she went upstairs, I sat in my father's study with the green binder open beneath the desk lamp. I read the trust language again and again until the clauses felt less like paper and more like a map through fog. The baby was the trigger, yes. Claire had understood that much. What she had not understood was that my father never built a vault that opened from only one side. I called Margaret Hale 3 days before Christmas from the parking lot of a Kroger on West Broad Street, because I did not want the conversation living inside my house. The sky was low and gray, the kind of Virginia winter sky that makes every building look older than it is. Shopping carts rattled across the asphalt. A Salvation Army bell rang near the entrance. Families walked past my truck carrying wrapping paper, oranges, and last-minute groceries, while I sat behind the wheel with my father's green binder on the passenger seat and my wife's handwriting burned into my memory. Child unlocks trust. Margaret answered on the second ring. Ethan, she said, and somehow my name in her voice already sounded like she knew. I did not start with emotion. Men in my family were bad at that. I started with facts. The questions Claire had asked. The false Pilates classes. Ryan Keller. The legal pad. The sudden pregnancy announcement followed by a Christmas dinner planned like a coronation. Margaret listened without interrupting. No gasps. No judgment. Just the faint sound of paper moving on her desk, then silence sharp enough to shave with. When I finished, she said, "Come to my office. Bring the binder. Bring your calendar. And do not warn Claire about anything else." Her office sat on the 3rd floor of a narrow brick building near Monument Avenue, above a title company and a dentist who had been there since the 80s. Nothing about it looked powerful, and that was Margaret's style. Real power rarely needs marble. It prefers file cabinets, clean pens, and doors that close softly. She met me in a charcoal suit, silver hair pinned at the back of her head, reading glasses hanging from a thin gold chain. On her desk sat my father's original trust documents, the ones I had not seen since the rain-soaked afternoon he made me sign my part. She placed her hand on the top page like she was steadying a witness. "Your father was not a suspicious man," she said. "He was a prepared one." I swallowed, because the difference mattered. Margaret turned to the section labeled Beneficiary Transition. Her finger moved down the page. The birth of a child can trigger review of family distributions, but it does not automatically release control. Your wife seems to understand the first half. She appears not to understand the second. She slid a second document toward me. Spousal acknowledgement. I had seen the phrase before, but now it looked different, less like procedure and more like a wire stretched across a doorway. Margaret explained it slowly. Before any trust adjustment connected to a child, the spouse had to sign a full acknowledgement stating that all information provided to the trustees was accurate, that no material facts had been withheld, and that independent verification could be required before funds moved. Verification, I said, though I already knew. Margaret did not soften it. Paternity, financial intent, outside claims, anything relevant to fraud or undue influence. The room seemed to narrow around that word. Fraud, not betrayal, not heartbreak. Fraud. Law has a way of stripping the poetry off pain. It gives ugly things clean labels so adults can survive them. I asked what happened if the acknowledgement was signed under false assumptions. Margaret looked at me over her glasses. If she signs while concealing information that affects the trust, she creates the record herself. Your father built that clause very deliberately. I leaned back, and the leather chair creaked beneath me. I thought I would feel relief. Instead, I felt tired all the way through my bones. Because legal protection is not the same as peace. It only means the storm has a roof over it. Margaret opened one more folder, thinner than the others. "There is something else," she said. Inside was a private letter from my father, sealed years earlier and released only if a spouse attempted to influence a beneficiary transition tied to a child. The envelope had my name on it in his blocky handwriting. "Ethan." My hand hovered over it, but I did not open it. Not yet. I was afraid of hearing him be right from the grave. Margaret watched me for a moment, then said, "You do not need to accuse her. You do not need to perform anger. You need to let the process do what it was designed to do." That sentence settled over me like cold air. Let the process work. Let Claire ask for the dinner. Let her sit beneath the Christmas lights. Let her hold our future in one hand and a pen in the other. Let her sign what she believed was a doorway into my family's money. I left Margaret's office just after 4, stepping into a wind that smelled like exhaust and snow. In my truck, I finally opened my father's letter. It was only 1 page. The first line nearly broke me. "Son, if you are reading this, I am sorry love made you hesitate." I folded the paper carefully, put it back in the envelope, and sat there until the streetlights flickered on. Then I drove home to Claire, who was waiting in the kitchen with a Christmas menu, a guest list, and the bright, careful smile of someone who believed the trap belonged to her. Christmas Eve arrived with snow in the forecast, and Claire moving through the house like a woman preparing for a photograph she intended to live inside forever. By noon, the caterers had taken over the kitchen. The dining room smelled like rosemary, butter, and glazed ham, and every surface in the house had been polished until it reflected candlelight. She had chosen white roses for the centerpiece, even though I told her my mother always used red berries and pine. "This is more elegant," Claire said, adjusting a ribbon around a napkin as if elegance were the only language that mattered. Noah was only 6 weeks old then, sleeping in his bassinet near the fireplace, tiny fists tucked under his chin, unaware that adults had already started placing meanings on him heavier than any child should ever carry. I stood in the doorway for a moment and watched Claire check the seating chart one more time. Margaret Hale sat to my right, Aunt Patricia across from her, my cousins, Daniel and Rebecca, near the end. Claire had placed herself beside the bassinet, where everyone could see her reach down and touch the blanket like a painting of motherhood. She had thought about every angle. That almost impressed me. Almost. Guests began arriving just after 5, shaking snow from their coats, carrying bottles of wine, kissing cheeks, saying how beautiful the house looked. Claire accepted every compliment with practiced warmth. She looked stunning in that white dress, simple from a distance, expensive up close. Her blonde hair brushed smooth over one shoulder, pearls at her ears, face glowing in the kind of way people expect from new mothers in holiday movies. Ryan Keller was not invited, of course. Men like Ryan do not need invitations to be present. They show up in phone screens, in nervous glances, in the small private confidence a woman carries when she believes someone outside the room is waiting for her victory report. I saw her check her phone twice before dinner. Once near the staircase, once beside the tree. Both times, her thumb moved fast, and her smile sharpened by a fraction. I said nothing. Silence had become the strongest tool I owned. At 6:30, we sat down. Silver touched china. Wine was poured. Margaret declined hers. Claire noticed that, and for the first time all evening, a little crease appeared between her brows. It vanished quickly. She lifted her glass and gave the speech she had rehearsed. She thanked everyone for coming, thanked the Whitaker family for making her feel welcome, and then looked down at Noah with moisture shining in her eyes. "This year gave us the greatest gift of all," she said. "A son, a future, a reason to honor what William built." My father's name in her mouth made the room feel colder. Aunt Patricia smiled politely, but her fingers tightened around her napkin. Margaret looked at me once, not asking permission, only confirming timing. I gave the smallest nod. After dessert, Claire cleared her throat and turned toward Margaret. "I believe there are a few family documents we wanted to handle tonight," she said, soft and bright, as if she had just suggested opening presents early. Margaret reached into her leather briefcase and removed the folder. No drama, no flourish, just paper. Claire's eyes followed it the way thirsty people follow water. The folder landed beside her plate with a quiet sound that seemed to pull every breath out of the room. Margaret explained the acknowledgement in plain language. Claire listened with the expression of someone pretending not to be impatient. Accuracy of information. Voluntary signature. Independent verification before any transition. She nodded at each phrase without letting any of them touch her. Of course, she said. I only want what is best for Noah. Then she picked up the pen. I watched her hand move across the page. I watched the ink form every letter of her name. I watched greed dress itself as motherhood and call it love. When she finished, she looked at me with triumph hidden behind tenderness. There, she whispered. Margaret let the silence sit for 3 long seconds. Then she turned the page over and placed a second sheet on top. Thank you, Claire, she said. Your acknowledgement activates the verification clause. Claire blinked. The what? Margaret's voice remained calm. Before any trust review proceeds, an independent paternity test is required, along with disclosure of any third-party claims or relevant communications. The color left Claire's face so slowly it was like watching winter move across a window. Her phone lit up beside her plate before she could stop it. One name flashed across the screen. Ryan Keller. No one spoke. The Christmas music kept playing in the next room, cheerful and distant, as if it belonged to another house entirely. Claire reached for the phone, but her fingers missed it the first time. Margaret placed one hand over the signed document. I looked at my wife, at the bassinet, at the white roses she had chosen because red was not elegant enough, and I felt the whole night turn on a single hinge. She had planned a celebration. My father had planned a test. And Claire had just signed herself into the truth. Claire looked at Ryan's name glowing on her phone like it had been placed there by a judge. For one long second, nobody moved. Snow tapped lightly against the windows. The candles burned steady. Noah made a soft sound from the bassinet, and every adult in that room seemed to remember at once that a child was sleeping beside the wreckage of grown-up choices. Claire turned the phone face down with a hand that no longer looked graceful. That is not relevant, she said, but her voice had lost the smooth edge she used at fundraisers and family dinners. Margaret did not argue. She opened a thin folder and removed the certified report that had arrived that morning under legal seal. I had not told Claire because I had not been required to. The test had been completed after Noah's birth through the hospital's independent process, the one Claire had agreed to during intake without reading carefully, the same way she had signed most things when she believed the outcome already favored her. Margaret placed the report beside the signed acknowledgement. Paper against paper. Truth against performance. The verification has already begun, Margaret said. The result is conclusive. Claire's mouth opened, but no words came out. I did not need Margaret to read the line aloud. I had read it alone in my truck that morning while the world moved around me, while shoppers carried gifts and children pressed their faces against bakery windows, and normal life continued with indecent calm. The report said I was not Noah's biological father. A sentence that short should not be able to empty a man, but it did. It hollowed out every imagined birthday, every future fishing trip, every little hand I had pictured holding in a parking lot. Still, when I looked at that baby by the fire, I did not feel anger toward him. He had not lied. He had not reached for money. He had not chosen any of this. He was innocent in a room full of strategy. Claire finally stood, her chair scraping softly against the rug. Ethan, I can explain. Those words are strange when they arrive too late. They do not open doors. They only prove the house has already burned. I looked at her, really looked at her, the white dress, the pearls, the trembling mouth, the woman who had once told me she wanted a real life, and then tried to use a child as a key to one she thought she deserved more. Not here, I said. My voice sounded calm, almost unfamiliar. Not in front of him. Aunt Patricia covered her mouth. My cousin Daniel stared into his wineglass like the answer might be hiding there. Margaret gathered the documents with the careful hands of someone who understood that ruin should still be handled neatly. She explained the consequences without cruelty. The trust review was suspended. Claire's spousal claims tied to the beneficiary transition were void under the acknowledgement she had just signed. Any attempt to access family assets through misrepresentation would be formally contested. Separate counsel would handle the marriage. Separate documents would handle custody questions with the appropriate parties. Law divided the disaster into folders because hearts cannot. Claire sat back down as if her legs had forgotten their purpose. The victory she had planned for months had turned into a locked room, and every exit had her signature on it. Her phone lit again. Ryan. Then again. Ryan. Nobody touched it. I walked to the bassinet and looked down at Noah. His tiny face was peaceful, unaware of names, bloodlines, trusts, or adults who build cages out of ambition. I adjusted the green blanket under his chin. My mother had knitted it years before she knew whether I would ever have a child. For a moment, the grief came so close to the surface that I had to close my eyes. When I opened them, I knew exactly what my father had meant. Protection was not bitterness. It was love with a longer memory. I turned back to Claire. She was crying now, but tears do not always mean remorse. Sometimes they mean the bill has come due. You thought Noah opened the trust, I said quietly. But my father built it to protect the family from anyone who treated a child like a password. She whispered my name, small and broken. I picked up my father's letter from the sideboard, the one I had carried in my jacket all night, and folded it once more. Then I left the dining room before Christmas could become another thing she ruined. Outside, the snow had begun to cover the driveway, softening the tire tracks, brightening the dark lawn. Behind me, the house glowed warm through the windows, but warmth is not the same as home. I stood there under the cold Virginia sky, breathing air that hurt and healed at the same time. I had lost the life I thought I was building, but I had not lost myself. That was the gift my father left me. Not $80 million. Not land. Not a name people recognized. He left me a door that greed could not walk through, even when it came smiling, dressed in white, holding a pin on Christmas Eve.